resolutions. Because you have already had a bite with them previously, they are a little bit familiar with the issues. So I'm going to hand over to Comrade Makhura to present the resolutions to yourselves. Over to you, Comrade Makhura.
Thank you very much, Comrade Pule. Good evening to you, members of the media. What I am sharing with you is very fresh, so we can't distribute the document to you because we just came out of the conclusions of the conference on discussions on strategy and tactics. So we have some work to do overnight as well as by tomorrow to finalize the draft that will be approved. The final draft will be approved by the National Executive Committee that was elected recently at Nasrec. So we would like to share with you some of the thinking that is emerging. Now, these are firm views of the ANC because the National Conference of the ANC is the highest decision-making body, so these are firm views. At the conclusion of the National Conference on the 20th, we gave you a sense of what was coming from the commissions, but we now have what are the firm views of the National Conference. The first thing that the National Conference arrived at is to reaffirm the strategic objective of the ANC, and this is has been in several policy documents of the ANC, principally in its strategy and tactics document. The first one published in 1969, but even before that one was published, the ANC's objective for South Africa has been the same, put in many different ways, but summarized as the creation of a national democratic society. And put differently, the building of a non-racial, non-sexist, united, democratic and prosperous society. And again, put differently, the resolution of what we regard as three basic contradictions. The first contradiction has to do with the issue of race. Race remains 28 years into our democracy. Race remains a very big issue. And anyone who denies that race still determines the fate and place of many people in society does not live in the real world. Not just in South Africa, but this question of the place of black people in the world. In many parts of the world, that's why you would have had a Black Lives Matter movement. That is a very key reality in many parts of the world. And the resolution of what we call is the question of racial segregation or racial oppression or racial discrimination is not something that can just be. You can't say because we adopted the new constitution we have a democracy. That question is resolved. It's an ongoing struggle. The various instruments, including even if it's in law, it may not be there, but there are many practices. Here, the conference was even saying, in many spaces in our society, you still have a place where black people, by the color of their skin, black people are discriminated against in workplaces. The instruments are no longer the same. Those instruments have changed because the laws of apartheid have ended, but the reality of living lives in the economy, black people are on the margins, and in many social spaces, including in spaces that may be regarded as private, when in fact those spaces are supposed, according to our constitution, to be accessible to everybody. So the resolution of that question is an ongoing focus of the ANC, and progressive forces in the world and anywhere else in the world must pay attention to that question. The second contradiction is the question of the women's oppression, essentially patriarchy. So the ANC for many years has dedicated, committed itself, articulated policies that the empowerment of women and the transformation of gender relations to achieve full equality between men and women is one of its three strategic objectives. That is a very, very important issue. Despite the progress we have made, we continue to experience major challenges. Women, again, they bear the burden of all major problems, whether it's climate change problems or pandemics, or economic slowdown, social problems, or gender-based violence, or when society is not doing very well, women bear the brunt of all social ills. So it's a fundamental issue, the ongoing efforts, the ongoing policy instruments and institutional mechanisms to ensure that women play their rightful role in our movement and in society and in global affairs. It's a very, very important issue reaffirmed by the National Conference today, but also the question of class, the super exploitation of particularly those who are the working class is an important issue for the ANC. For many years, the ANC has spoken about women suffering triple oppression, but so working class people, particularly those who are black, and by black we mean, this conference emphasized that when we talk about black, we are talking about the way we have spoken about it in history. We are talking about people, the Africans, we are talking about those classified by apartheid as the colored people. We are talking about people of Indian descent, all of whom are South Africans. So so this question about resolving these three interrelated contradictions and therefore putting efforts and policy interventions to ensure that we build a non-racial society, a non-sexist society, a democratic and prosperous society has been the focus of the discussions at NASREC. Because the report we brought here is born out of the discussions at NASREC. And the ANC also emphasizes that in dealing with this issue of the creation of a national democratic society, a non-racial, non-sexist, united, democratic and prosperous society, the key issue for us is fundamental transformation. Referred in other conference resolutions as radical socio-economic transformation. So fundamental change. So you will find that our objective is not to just reform and ameliorate the colonial apartheid social relations. And when we do an assessment, we did a comprehensive assessment of where are we now. When we do that assessment, we have been able to identify that we have made gains, substantial gains in other areas, but in some areas we have stagnated. And in other areas we are actually moving in reverse. So in striving for this type of society we want to build, as the African National Congress, this fundamental transformation of our society, this fundamental change, which is about the total overhaul of apartheid, colonial relations, and the legacy and everything we have inherited from that system. In striving to do that, we have made progress in varying degrees. So the conference made a full assessment of that progress. I'll share that with you about the conclusions of the conference. So the conference then says that, so if that's what the ANC stands for, what kind of ANC members do we need? What is the role of an ANC member? That we need the most committed to this vision. We need the most loyal to the kind of South Africa we want, the most loyal to the people of South Africa. We need the most ethical, the most committed, and the most capable. That's what the ideal that we should be doing everything, and the commission that is now being discussed about organizational renewal is now dealing with. So how do you produce this type of ANC member? We have many problems. We have spoken about them publicly, about the shortcomings of our membership at the moment. But we strive, we want to create, we want ANC members to distinguish themselves as the most committed to our country, to this transformation of our country, the most committed to our constitutional democratic order. And at this point is important. When we talk about transformation, we talk about it in the context of a constitutionalism, a constitutional democracy. And conference says the ANC must not be shy to say that it has been the principal architect of our constitutional democracy. The ANC was not pushed into a corner by the apartheid forces and outmaneuvered to have a constitutional democracy. The ANC has discussed constitutionalism from 1923, adopted the Bill of Rights, 1943, adopted the African Claims, 1955, the Freedom Charter, and from 1986, President Oliver Tambo was leading discussions in exile about how do we refine and produce a proper constitutional order, which is what the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa was informed by that hard work. So the ANC members must understand that the constitutional democracy was not a strategic compromise. It is a preferred vision of the ANC that we want, the ANC, the conference has been saying that it must be the ANC members who defend our constitutionalism. But our constitutionalism is transformative constitutionalism. It's not just about keeping the current status quo, which I referred to earlier on continuing exclusion of black people, women on the margins, and bearing the brunt, and the working class, particularly the black working class, suffering super exploitation at workplaces. So our constitutionalism is transformative, and is there in the Constitution. So we have a Bill of Rights that says that the state must ensure that we restore the human dignity of all South Africans. And it spells out the socio-economic rights, but it is the state. That's why we need a state that functions. It's the state that must help achieve those objectives. So our democracy, what the conference says, is a democracy with South African characteristics, and our constitutionalism is a constitutionalism with South African characteristics. It has got political rights and freedoms, because sometimes people in public discourse, people in the media often, or commentators, often talk only about the political freedoms, and they don't want to talk about the socio-economic rights, that the transformation that is required in that sense. So the conference today reaffirmed that, and the conference world. Where does the ANC fit in this? And what should the ANC do? Remember what our objective is. So we are doing that in a particular international historical context. There are particular forces in the world, those that are not so committed, that are not even committed to fundamental transformation the kind we want. There are conservative forces, there are neoliberal forces, there are liberal forces that want to preserve particular privilege and exclude some large sections of populations from enjoying the benefit of the resources of their own society. So So we said we live in a period where, firstly, there's a crisis of neoliberalism. Now, so this is, when you say the crisis of neoliberalism, so the particular dominant system, global system, that came to in the 1980s, where the state was organized in a particular way, policies were organized in a particular way, remove the state from the economy, the state must not play a key interventionist role, and particular the emphasis about the only thing is the market, that we understand the market a role to a place in economic development, but the state has a critical role to play. There's significant market failure, and in fact, 30 years later, after the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s, we now have lots of scholarship and lots of evidence, policy evidence, that this notion that governments and states must not be involved in the economic development, that notion never worked anywhere else. Asia, for example, East Asia, Asia developed at the back of a very strong developmental state. And Europe itself, some of those key European in the Second World War period came out of the crisis they had because they had functional social democracies, those social democracies that took care of people. So neoliberalism, this way, essentially that's Thatcherism, this way that was the dominant Thatcher-Reagan philosophy in the 1980s, that essentially removed the state from everything and leave a that Brazil was run by the right-wing government. There's a left-wing government. Lula and many progressive governments we identify with did a lot to solve problems of poverty, inequality, including racism in Brazil. So we are inspired. This conference says that we see in Latin America, we see it in some of the countries, but we also see a development very disturbing in Europe. The rise of populism and right-wing governments, particularly in Europe. We have had that situation in America when Donald Trump was there. That was part of that rise of conservative forces, right-wing conservative forces that were there. What were they doing to a progressive agenda like ours? A progressive agenda, many progressive governments in some parts of the world were either on the retreat or they were removed. Right-wing and populist governments come and progressive governments get removed. And the ANC has very important lessons to draw from that. And sometimes to also draw lessons. Why would a progressive government be removed? And we look at our own shortcomings and weaknesses and how the right wing can mobilize people behind it, even if naturally it is against their own interest. So we also observe the rise of China is not receding. So China has been on the ascendancy, the rise of China as a global power. But there are also blocks like BRICS. BRICS is an important regional bloc. We are part of the BRICS countries. In fact, it is anticipated that there are more countries that want to join BRICS now, rather than just not the few that are there now that are called BRICS. There are more countries that want to be part of this regional bloc. It's setting up its own institutions. But BRICS, the rise of BRICS is and the rise of China is also being countered by governments and forces we call conservative and competitive forces that see China as a rival. How is this being countered? Through things like trade wars, for example. So this is not just a free ride in that kind of a sense. So there are those forces. So the ANC is part of the progressive, the global progressive forces. We're part of the BRICS countries. And in there, we are trying to develop a counterweight. We are trying to create a counterweight for a development path chosen by countries in the global south, rather than dominated by the hegemons in the global north. Where are the hegemons in North America and in Europe? So we're trying to create, together with the African countries. We also discussed the impact of COVID-19. I will not say much about it. Conference, I think, has identified how we dealt with COVID-19, how other forces, geopolitically, COVID-19 was contested, vaccine nationalism. The war in Ukraine was a very important part of the discussions here. And the ANC's analysis is that that's no longer just a Russia-Ukraine war. The ANC's conclusion at its conference is that we now have that war is now, we have key countries, the US and the NATO military alliance are participating. It has ceased to just be a war between two countries. It's now a major war that is threatening world peace. And it undermines, as the conference said, the peace dividend that was imagined there, the post-war, the post-Cold War world, that 30 years ago there were prospects that we would have the end of the Cold War. The subtleties around the Cold War going on this, and that the ANC's engagements with the war will always be from the standpoint of South Africa's historical position. And that South Africa's historical position and the ANC's historical position is we have been part of the non-aligned movement during the liberation struggle. We have also, in our own experience here at home, preached that every revolution born out of our own experience, every conflict must end with peaceful. So when you have a struggle, our own struggle ended up with a negotiated settlement. So every conflict in our continent and everywhere in the world, we emphasize that there must be negotiations. The protagonists must be brought to the negotiating table. Beating the drums of war and joining the conflict is not necessarily going to help us address the fundamental issues of sustainable development. So that's the critical issue. Now is the conclusion of conference. The conference discussed extensively the impact of climate change in our country. Sorry, may I have my water? Cheers. Cheers to you. So the conference says climate change is not a rumor, and it is not fake news. It's real. And we have to deal with the impact of climate change. The climate crisis is being felt and mainly affects particularly underdeveloped communities. We just see it in our country now. The floods in Gauteng and in KwaZulu-Natal, the impact of those floods on people's lives. So we've got to tackle these issues very, very decisively to ensure that we adopt indeed a low-carbon path, a low-carbon development path. But that low-carbon development path must be just, it must be fair, it must be sustainable, because we have strategic resources that we can't just abandon overnight. And that's why we engage in this issue of the just transition in global forums and insist that the developed countries in the global north have contributed more to the problems of climate change. Because of their industrialization and the industrialization path, they've contributed more. They must contribute more to the solution of this problem, and not just ask the countries in the global south to abandon their own development ambitions with the hope that something better will come. Yes, we are very committed to the just transition, but we want to chart our own path in that sense. Technological change is something that we discussed extensively, its opportunities and threat. And the ANC essentially is directing that at all levels of government in particular, steps must be taken to harness, to train and prepare the workforce, the labor force, the youth of our country, the women of our country with the digital skills that are going to be needed for the new economy, our entrepreneurs to participate in that digital economy so that we're not left out of the fourth or fifth industrial revolution as Africa was left out before. So there's a big emphasis there on the issues of technology, the investments in infrastructure and in skills that must be there. So that's part of the key things, because these questions about technology in the world and the digital transformation, digital transition could lead to major exclusion of countries in the South. Developing countries could be left out, and only an elite in the global North. An elite is already the ones that is harvesting the real benefits. Wealth is accumulating amongst very few companies and amongst very few individuals in the global North. Technology is supposed to be helping us to expand development and ensure greater levels of access and opportunities for many. We also identified as a conference that women and youth need to receive particular priority from the ANC in our work in government, but also in the global forums across the world, the forums in which we sit. We want to champion the Gender Agenda 2032, but also the youth agenda in the continent and globally and here at home. And then the issues in our continent, there's two important developments that the ANC is concerned about. One is positive. We dealt with COVID very well as a continent. Our response was better coordinated. We worked better as a continent. We have introduced the African Continental Free Trade Area. It's a huge opportunity, but we are concerned about conflict in our own continent. So there are different regions in our continent where there's a resurgence of conflict. We know in East Africa, especially Ethiopia, we have been involved now in resolving that issue. We know in northern Mozambique. We also know in some parts of our continent the resurgence of coups in Central Africa and in some parts of West Africa. The resurgence. So we're going back. We were making substantial progress. Development in our continent will not happen if you have conflict, and if you have military regimes are not going to bring about development. So we stand firmly on the side of democratic development and structural change, and we don't support. African leadership must be firm and decisively intervene when we have conflicts that undermine Africa's development or that undermine democracy. So let's conclude with what the situation. So this is the global affairs, global situation we're discussing. But here at home, what we call the domestic balance of forces. So what are the key issues that the ANC has identified, and what are we going to do about those key issues? The first one, conference says that we are approaching a very important milestone as a country. 2024 is 30 years of our democracy, our constitutional democracy. This is not just a democracy, but is a constitutional democracy. So as we approach 30 years of our constitutional democracy, so this conference has started a process of looking back to say, what have we actually achieved? So what will we be reporting at the end of 3 decades of our democracy? So the conference looked at those things. What have been the democratic gains that have been made? And what have been the setbacks? What have been where are we standing, stagnating, and where are the reversals? So conference is at one to say that, in fact, there are democratic gains that we must continue to defend, highlight, because there are people in our country who want to say, in many different ways, that actually life was better under apartheid than now. And we say that we reject that notion, we reject those insinuations, we reject those underlying views that it was better under apartheid and that actually we must return to apartheid. It is not stated publicly, but the conduct and the behavior of certain forces in our country, certain forces about the retaining white domination, retaining colonial privilege, that behavior is there. And we say that there have been substantial gains that must be defended. So you sitting here, you would say, so there's a story that no, but there's not much that has been achieved. The ANC has sold out we make the point that firstly we are a constitutional democracy. We have adopted a constitution. This constitution is not just something on paper. It guarantees the rights and freedoms of all South Africans, the political rights and the socio-economic rights and freedoms. We live by this constitution. We defend it, even when the courts rule not in our favor. The ANC, yes, we may have criticism even of court judgments, including even of, to criticize the Constitutional Court can be a crime. But this constitution was brought about by us, by choice. As I said, the ANC has worked over many years to want to create a country governed by constitution, where everybody, every institution, every individual, including those in authority, including those who are in any other institution, are not above the constitution. So this is a very important. Socioeconomic rights, we have made progress in the expansion of infrastructure and basic services to millions of people. We note after this that there's been some areas where the progress we have made is now stagnating. But in this country, we have made substantial, based on the constitution, people have access to housing that did not have access to housing, access to education. The number of young people who are particularly in the higher education sector, the number of young people who are now in the higher education sectors through NSFAS, through government support, is over 1 million. Higher education and further education together. So those numbers, when I was at university as a student leader, almost 30 years ago, 30 years ago, the funding for higher education was largely through the churches. Particularly, a lot of students were supported by the NGOs, the churches, the goodwill of our friends overseas. Now we have access to education, access to healthcare, access to water, access to energy, and other basic services. We come back to point to what the problems are now. Some of the areas, the energy problems. So we have made progress. Some of the issues around water security, we have made progress. But there are an infrastructure. We have rolled out infrastructure in many areas across the country. But we acknowledge that in some of those areas, there's beginning to be problems right now. We have a political system in our country. In South Africa, we have regular elections. We have a free press, and that's why you are here. We didn't force you to be here. You are free to report about this. These are part of the gains. We have democratic institutions that function in accordance with the Constitution. If any of the institutions violate the Constitution, anybody can go to court, and they will be brought to book on those. They will be found on the wrong. We have set our economy on a path of growth, even with all the problems that we have of our economy. And we speak about them in the next paragraph that I'll take you through what the problems are. But South Africa's economy was in serious decline before 1994. For a period, almost a decade, between 1994 and 2004, our economy was growing at a decent percentage. It has other structural problems. It had other problems, and we now have some of those problems are growing bigger and bigger. The transformation is not optimal. We had some experience about black people entering in some sectors of the economy a decade or so, a decade and a half ago. In some of these areas, we are now regressing. Women and black people who are entering in those areas, the situation is getting reversed in many of those areas now. But the ANC has arrived at a conclusion at this conference that there's real gains that have been made. And these gains must be advanced, they must be consolidated, they must be defended. They must also be highlighted. Because the notion that things have not changed and everything is worse, things are worse than they were under apartheid, is false. But we know it fits racial privilege. It fits the right-wing narrative and racist racial supremacy. The notion that it was better under apartheid and nothing has changed, and the ANC things are worse under the ANC government, That notion does not, the picture is not quite like that. It's more complex. There are gains that must be defended, and there are setbacks. And what are these setbacks? So we ourselves emerge from this conference saying that from the policy conference already we identified the fact that there are issues that threaten our democracy. So our constitutional democracy and its gains are being threatened by things around which we are either stagnant or we are moving in reverse. One of them is the fact that we have chronic poor performance of our economy. The chronic poor performance with regard to employment, with regard to transformation, in other words, bringing in, diversifying our economy, bringing in more women and black people to be key players in this economy. The impact of that is something that undermines the gains. It can actually reverse the gains of our constitutional democracy. In addition, we have rising lawlessness, rising criminality is intensifying, and violence is in many areas of our society. It's not just gender-based violence, but gender-based violence is the crudest form of this violence. Violence is becoming the order of the day. Now, these things will threaten, obviously, our constitutional democratic order. Social cohesion is getting eroded, and racism is rearing its ugly head, as we have said. And we don't need to give you examples. We see that racism, the thought that no, because apartheid is no longer in law, the situation is okay. That thought is not necessarily reflecting the true reality. But we also have other problems, gender-based violence, deep levels of gender-based violence. We have an energy crisis. We have the rising cost of living. And all those issues taken together with a very important aspect of our own self-critique, state capture and corruption. If you take the objective conditions of the majority of the people, take them together with the fact that we have had increased levels of the erosion of public confidence because of state capture and corruption. If you take those things together, they threaten collectively to erode and undermine the gains of our democracy. So that is why the ANC, in the next set of commissions that are now tabling their report, the ANC is dealing with each of these areas. How are we going to ensure that the state can decisively deal with all these issues that threaten to erode our democracy? In that sense, therefore, the ANC also says, in addition to the weaknesses of the state and ourselves as the ANC, but we also have come to a conclusion that the conservative and right-wing forces in South Africa are gaining more confidence, they are more aggressive in undermining and trying to challenge the democratic and transformation agenda of that, which is something that our constitution mandates. So we are very clear that some of the forces that those opposed to transformation of our country, those who still hold very clear, firm views on the principal exclusion of black people, their marginalization from everything else, including of women. Some of those forces are very much prevalent and gaining confidence. And they're also using the institutions of our democracy. They go to court to challenge transformation. They coexist with us because we didn't defeat them. This was a negotiated settlement. They are gaining more confidence. And the ANC, the last conclusion of the conference here was that the balance of forces actually are tilting. If you look at the election results, tell you one part of the story, but not the totality of it. That the balance of forces, we are not in the best position we have been before to advance and carry forward the transformation agenda. We have more forces that are opposed to us, including those fundamentally and deadly opposed to the transformation of South Africa into a national democratic society. They are more confident because we live in a democracy. They are more confident. But we need new instruments to really punish racism. We need new instruments to deal with gender-based violence. Not just, we need to look at policy instruments and mechanisms. We can't allow racists to roam around, beat up people, they come across, they make certain places no-go areas. We can't allow that to happen and simply say, well, they don't have a democratic right to do what they are doing. They will instigate violence, actually. They'll instigate violence amongst those, particularly black people who are feeling bayadelelwa nje. They go to places, they are going out to a restaurant, going out to a place just to enjoy yourself in a public place, or even in a private place or open to the public. And they just get, not just discriminated against, they get attacked. So the ANC says that's one thing we have to deal with decisively coming out of this conference, and we need the state to sharpen its instruments to confront and deal with racism. But the ANC reaffirms that in the area of economic transformation, there are also policies that have not worked. And I can't say to you which ones, because those ones are now being discussed by the different commissions. That there are where policies have not worked, we must boldly actually say this policy has not worked. Our economy, we have tried this policy, things are not improving. We can't be married to a policy that's not producing results. So the discussion on strategy and tactics also says we must boldly review policy. We are going to review our overall strategy and tactics. We are going to review it. This year we are going to convene a series of consultative strategy sessions. So all these issues we are raising will go into we will review our strategy and tactics. We are also reviewing policy. As I say, boldly say, this policy has worked. Yes, it needs to be given a chance. This policy is new. It has not yet produced results, but it is new. We can't change policy all the time, but we can't stick equally. We can't stick with a policy religiously that does not produce results. We need that tactical flexibility. If the problem is stubborn, and we have introduced policy that doesn't work, we need to introduce new policies in certain areas. So we are saying, conference says, we will not tolerate corruption and intolerance, corruption and incompetence in our ranks. You are saying, how are you going to do this? The Commission on Organizational Renewal now is discussing the additional instruments. We have the Integrity Commission. We're going to set up a monitoring and evaluation at headquarters led by one of our Deputy Secretary General who will do that. We're going to tighten the noose on those who are sent to government. The ANC will be monitoring them more closely now, ensuring that people are held accountable in the party on service delivery. On measurable targets, on transformation in all areas of social policy and economic policy. So we also say we are part of the global progressive forces. There are many areas that the ANC says we want to expand our work in those areas internationally, including drawing lessons from the new environment and opportunities presented by these many transitions. The alliance is a very important part of the ANC. We reaffirmed in this conference the importance of the alliance, but the alliance needs to be re-looked at as well. That's why there's a discussion in the SACP and in COSATU about reconfiguration. The ANC says, yes, we need this alliance 30 years into a democracy. We also need to look into how the alliance needs to adapt itself to the new conditions. There's no doubt that we need the alliance. But we also need to broaden the forces. There are forces that are new social forces that were not part of the liberation struggle. We want to win them to the table. That is why we have that broad consultative conference on strategy and tactics. There are many NGOs and social movements that are social justice oriented. They are issue based. Some of them are calling for the reform of the reform of the electoral system. They want transformation. They want democratization. They want social justice. They want economic justice. But we may not always be agreeing with them on certain issues. We want to broaden that base, work with them. about where do we take South Africa from here. 30 years into our democracy. So we will start that session this year, consultative session with these various forces. But we also want to firm up, this conference has agreed that coalitions are an important part of our tactic, not strategy. So there's the strategic objective of the ANC is not going to change. The need to create this society, the need to transform South Africa is not going to change. But the tactics of how we get there, we will work with those who agree with us on a range of issues, the development agenda, the transformation that needs to happen, the improvement of the quality of life that needs to happen. We will work with, so our approach to coalitions is that the coalitions must be more stable. We want more stable coalition government. If legislation must be introduced to ensure stability of coalitions, we would support that. But we don't want to be in power for its own sake. We don't just want to be in a coalition because we want to share the spoils of office. We don't want just to be in political office. We want to have the potential and the possibility to use that power to use, if we have a coalition government that cannot drive a transformation agenda in the municipality, a development agenda, a service delivery agenda, nationally, if we should get there, or provincially, we should be looking at the common set of issues, a vision we share for South Africa. So we're basically saying as the ANC conference that we're not going to just chase everyone, every coalition partner, just because we must be in government. If we have to be in opposition because we don't want to be party to a group of coalitions that are a right-wing coalition, we will choose to do so. We don't want to be part of a right-wing coalition that undermines transformation, that undermines our constitutional democracy, that advances racism or white supremacy or colonial privilege. We don't want to be part of that. So this question about coalitions is an important aspect, but we want to approach it from the point of view of principle and what our strategic goal is supposed to be. So those issues, all these issues will be finalized and consolidated in this series of strategic consultations we will have. We will have one in 2023 this year, later this year, led by the newly elected NEC. But we'll also have follow-up ones in 2024. We would have looked at what the outcome of the national elections are. We'll also do further consultations there to assess our strategic options. How do we advance the transformation agenda and the consolidation of our constitutional democratic order? So that's kind of the flavor of it. So I would like to stop there, Comrade Pule.
Thank you very much, Comrade Makhura. I'm sure you have, you all have got, okay, you can start, and then after him you will follow. We'll take all the hands. Okay. Just hold for me. Yes. Oh, so what are you? Oh, you don't need to use.
Oh, thank you so much. It's me who needs a pen. Thank you. I want to write what you're going to say.
Thank you.
Can we take the questions and then you answer all of them, because sometimes you find that they are similar. Okay.
From Eyewitness News. Mr. Makhura, you spoke a lot about gender-based violence and how much of a crisis it is, and that the ANC needs to find more instruments to combating